The bottles were beautiful. That is what the record preserves first. Not the deaths, not the confessions, not the names of the men who died with physicians standing at their bedsides writing down fever and flux and God's will in careful Latin script. The record preserves, before anything else, the appearance of the thing. Small glass vials, elegant, the kind sold by apothecaries and street vendors across the cities of the Italian peninsula, the kind kept on the dressing tables of women who had very little and wanted, at least in the small domestic theater of their own rooms, to appear otherwise. The oil inside was clear. It had no smell anyone recorded. It left no taste anyone survived to describe. Between approximately 1633 and 1651, roughly 600 men in Rome, Naples, and the surrounding regions died of what their physicians recorded as natural illness. They were not ill. The word their physicians wanted, the word that would not arrive for another quarter century, not until the trial records were translated, copied, and circulated, was poisoned. Their wives poisoned them. Wives of merchants, wives of minor nobility, wives of men whose names appear now only in death records and property transfers, poisoned using a product they had purchased discreetly from a network of distributors operating through the cosmetics trade, a product manufactured by a single woman working out of modest rooms, first in Palermo, then in Naples, then in Rome itself, the city of the Pope, of the Inquisition, of the most sophisticated institutional apparatus of surveillance and social control in the Western world. She operated for nearly 20 years. No one noticed. That is the fact that does not release. Not the number. The number is difficult, possibly inflated, drawn from confessions extracted under torture, and filtered through the account-keeping of a papacy that had every reason to make the scandal as large as possible. The number may be wrong, but the duration is not disputed, and the duration is, in some ways, more instructive than the count. 20 years. A generation of women quietly purchasing, administering, and watching. 20 years of physicians writing the wrong word in the ledger. 20 years in which the system that was supposed to catch this, the church, the magistracy, the medical establishment, looked directly at what was happening and recorded something else. Her name was Giulia Tofana. What she built was not a conspiracy. It was a service. To understand the service, you must first understand what she was selling into, the particular texture of domestic life in 17th century Italy, the way the air inside a certain kind of marriage could feel. Rome in the 1640s was a city of approximately 115,000 people, dense and vertical, its ancient streets running beneath the shadows of building facades that had been under construction, it sometimes seemed, since the beginning of the world. The smell of it was the smell of every large early modern city, animal and vegetable, smoke from hearths, the particular sweetness of bread from bakeries that opened before dawn, cut always by the darker current of the Tiber in summer, when it ran low and warm. It was loud in a way we do not fully recover. The bells, the vendors, the argument of carts over cobblestone, crowded, alive. And within all of that life, within apartments stacked 3 and 4 stories above those streets, within the domestic space that was a woman's legal and practical universe, something quieter, a kind of compression. A woman in the Rome of 1645 had limited legal personhood. She passed, in the eyes of church and civil law both, from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. Divorce did not exist. Annulment was available in theory and functionally inaccessible to anyone without money, connection, and the extraordinary patience required to navigate the Roman rota, the Church's matrimonial tribunal, over a period of years that could run to decades. A husband controlled his wife's property. He could restrict her movements. He could subject her to violence that his contemporaries would not necessarily have classified as violence. A contemporary legal commentary from the period describes the husband's corrective authority in terms that apply equally to the management of children and servants. What the record does not preserve in most cases is the texture of individual marriages. What it does preserve are the moments when those marriages passed into the administrative record by force, the dowry contracts, the death inventories, the occasional court petition where a woman, having reached some threshold of circumstance that even the law of the time could not ignore, attempted to make a formal complaint. Those petitions survive in Italian archives, and they are difficult documents. They are written in the careful language of legal petition, which means that what was done to the petitioner has been translated into formulas. Phrases like excessive cruelty and grave bodily harm and destitution of the matrimonial household that drain the events they describe of most of their actual content. Behind the formula is something the formula will not say. The record of what it will not say is its own kind of testimony. A woman in this situation had several options. She could endure. She could appeal to her family if her family had standing and will to intervene, which many did not. She could appeal to the church, which would likely return her to her husband with instructions to pray. She could attempt flight, which was legally actionable against her and socially ruinous. Or she could find Giulia Tofana. It is not recorded how the first client found her. Networks of this kind leave no founding document. What the later confessions describe, extracted under conditions that make their precision uncertain, but consistent enough across multiple accounts to suggest something real at their core, is a structure that had clearly existed long enough to develop protocols. Women did not approach Giulia directly. They were referred. A friend, a neighbor, a woman at the same market, a trusted servant. The first conversation, whatever it was, did not use the word poison. This is recorded explicitly in at least one account. The language was the language of relief, of remedy, of something that could be done, finally, about a situation that had no other solution. What you purchased, if you chose to purchase it, was described as a cosmetic water, an acqua della Madonna, water of the Madonna, in one formulation that has struck subsequent readers with an almost theatrical irony. It was sold in small glass vials. The label, where a label existed, identified it as cosmetic oil. The label told the truth about the container. It was silent about the contents. Giulia's origins require reconstruction from sources that are partial, sometimes hostile, and, in the case of the trial records, produced under legal coercion. What is established is this. She was born around 1620, most likely in Palermo in the island of Sicily, which was then part of the Spanish crown's Italian possessions and operated under a legal and social system that was in some respects even more restrictive than the mainland. Her mother's name was Tofania d'Adamo. In 1633, when Giulia was approximately 13 years old, Tofania d'Adamo was publicly executed in Palermo. The charge was the poisoning of her husband, Giulia's father. The record does not clarify whether Tofania was guilty. It records the verdict and the sentence and the date. What it does not record, cannot record, is what Giulia Tofana saw that year, or what she understood from it. A daughter watching her mother die for killing a man the law had given her no other means to leave. Whether this is where Giulia's knowledge began, or whether the knowledge came later through other channels, the trial records are silent on. They note the family connection. They do not speculate on its meaning. That restraint, in documents otherwise not particularly restrained, is itself a kind of note in the margin. By the mid-1630s, Giulia had relocated to Naples. By the early 1640s, she was in Rome. The operation moved with her, grew with her. She was not working alone. The accounts describe a network that included her daughter, Girolama Spera, and a number of women who functioned as distributors, moving the product through the channels of the cosmetics and apothecary trade. Rome was a city whose streets were thick with vendors of cosmetic preparations, herbal remedies, and the various compounds that promise to improve the complexion, sweeten the breath, or reduce swelling in the joints. A small glass vial of cosmetic water drew no particular attention. The trade was dominated by women. The customers were women. The transactions were unremarkable. What Julia was producing in the rooms she occupied at various addresses across Rome, none of them grand, all of them functional, was a solution of arsenic trioxide dissolved in water, to which some accounts add lead and belladonna in smaller concentrations. The arsenic was its primary instrument. Arsenic trioxide was available in the 17th century as a commercial substance, used in the dyeing of textiles, the treatment of some skin conditions, and the killing of rats. It was not controlled in any meaningful sense. Its purchase left no record. Its properties were well understood by apothecaries and moderately well understood by the general public. In a culture where poisoning was frequent enough to have generated its own popular lexicon, arsenic was not a secret. What Julia understood, what transformed a substance available at any dyer's supplier into a system capable of operating for 20 years, was the pharmacology of low-dose administration. Arsenic trioxide, administered in a single large dose, kills quickly and unmistakably, producing symptoms that even a 17th century physician could connect to poisoning: violent cramping, vomiting, neurological convulsion, a particular discoloration of the lips and fingers that appears in the forensic literature. Administered in a single large dose, it announces itself. It leaves witnesses. It leaves questions. Administered in small doses, over weeks or months, it does something else. The symptoms it produces in chronic low-dose exposure: fatigue, gradual appetite loss, what contemporaries called a wasting of the body, eventually a slowing of the heart, and a failure of the organs that looks, to anyone without modern toxicological screening, entirely consistent with an ordinary fever of the kind that killed men regularly and unremarkably in the 17th century, are symptoms that a physician, arriving at a bedside in 1645, would have recognized as illness, not as evidence of crime, as the ordinary attrition of a world in which a man could be in reasonable health in January and dead in March, and no one would ask why, because March took men all the time. The dosage instructions that Julia provided have not survived in their original form. What the confessions record is that clients were told how many drops, and in what intervals, and in what liquids the product could be concealed. Water, wine, soup. The product was clear. It had no taste anyone could distinguish from the water or wine or soup it was added to. The men who were dying were being dosed in their own kitchens, at their own tables, out of bottles that sat on their wives' dressing tables and looked exactly like everything else that sat on their wives' dressing tables. That detail, the dressing table, appears in several of the accounts, and it is worth pausing on. In the domestic architecture of a 17th century Roman household of middling means, the wife's dressing table was her private space in an apartment that otherwise belonged, legally and practically, to her husband. It was the one surface where her objects were arranged according to her own order. The bottles on it were hers, and among those bottles, the rose water, the scented oil, the preparations for the skin, sat the small vial that was something else entirely. The domestic space that was meant to define her containment had become, in the most material sense possible, the site of her agency. This is not a romanticization. Women died who did not need to. But the geography of it is real, and the record preserves it. The price of aqua tofana is not precisely documented. The accounts suggest it varied, by quantity, by the circumstances of the purchaser, by the relationship between purchaser and distributor. What is clear is that it was not free, and it was not accessible to the very poorest women who could not afford it and likely could not access the networks through which it was sold. This is a detail the accounts do not emphasize, but which the economics require. The women who reached Julia were women who had, or could borrow, enough. The women who had nothing. The women in the worst circumstances. The women without the social connections that led to the network's referral chain. Those women are not in the record at all. That absence is its own form of evidence. The clients who do appear in period accounts, filtered, remember, through trial testimony and confession, which means they appear as defined by the prosecution's framing, were women of the artisan class, the minor merchant class, and occasionally the lower nobility. They were not women acting out of greed in the majority of documented cases. They were not primarily after inheritances, though inheritance was sometimes a consequence. The motives recorded most frequently, when motives were recorded at all, were variations on a single theme: a marriage that was causing active harm, with no legal exit available and no authority willing to intervene; a woman whose husband beat her and whose family had spent her dowry, and whose parish priest had told her to pray with more earnestness. She had options in the technical sense. What she did not have was a path. Julia understood this. The account suggests she was not indiscriminate. Whether this represents a genuine moral framework or a practical assessment of risk is something the record cannot settle. What the record shows is behavior consistent with selection, that the women she sold to were, in the preponderance of documented cases, women who had demonstrable reason to want their husbands dead, and who had no other recourse that anyone in their world had offered them. Whether Julia asked these questions out of conscience or out of the knowledge that a desperate woman with a legitimate grievance is a safer customer than an opportunistic one, she was by the evidence a methodical person. She had survived, and she was not unintelligent about the things that made survival possible. Her daughter Girolama functioned as a distributor and, by some accounts, as a counselor of sorts to clients, the person who received them, assessed them, communicated the product's use. A network this size requires management. It requires the same administrative capacity that any sustained enterprise requires: the ability to assess character, maintain discretion, ensure product consistency, manage the expectations of people who are frightened, and who may, at any moment, decide that fear has become unbearable. The accounts do not describe Julia's organization in business terms, because the accounts were produced by people whose interest was in prosecuting her. But the organization ran for 20 years. Whatever it actually was, it functioned. She was known, one account states, in the translated formulation, to be a woman of considerable intelligence and care. The source is a post-execution summary produced by the papal administration, and the phrase sits uneasily in its context, surrounded as it is by language of condemnation. The writer included it anyway. What the operation required, above all, was the silence of physicians, not their active complicity, not their knowledge of what was happening, their simple, practiced inclination to record what they expected to see, and to expect to see what they had always seen before. A physician in mid-17th century Rome was not equipped for toxicological analysis. The understanding of poison as a traceable substance, something that could be isolated from tissue, identified chemically, presented in a court as physical evidence, was more than a century away from reliable practice. What a physician had was observation. Observation of symptoms, filtered through the explanatory framework available to him, which was a combination of Galenic humoral theory, practical empirical knowledge accumulated over years of practice, and the strong cognitive tendency to find in a set of symptoms the illness he had seen before. A man, weakening over weeks, losing appetite, growing pale, eventually dying, in an era before germ theory, before systematic epidemiology, before any conceptual framework that would have prompted the question, what caused this? The answer was, illness caused it. The flux caused it. The fever caused it. God's will, ultimately, caused it. This was not negligence in any meaningful sense. It was the limit of available knowledge. The limit was real, and Julia's operation was designed, whether consciously or through the accumulated experience of 20 years, to stay precisely within it. The smell of a Rome apartment in summer, with a man dying slowly inside it, wood smoke from the hearth, the herbs his wife kept burning to sweeten the air, the particular heaviness that illness gives a room. The physician who came, set down his bag, took the pulse, and wrote his notes, was operating in a sensory and cognitive environment that gave him almost no purchase on the truth of what he was seeing. He wrote what the environment told him to write. The death was recorded. The widow, after the appropriate period, was free, for a certain value of free. Her husband's property passed according to law. Life reorganized itself around the space he had left. 600 times, or something like 600 times, this process completed itself. Then a woman panicked. Her name is not in the historical record. She appears in the accounts as a client, a woman who had purchased aqua tofana, who had begun administering it to her husband, and who, at some point in the process, stopped. What stopped her? Fear, guilt, a sudden reconsideration of what she was doing. Some specific thing her husband did or said in those weeks that reorganized what she felt about him. This is not recorded. The accounts note only that she reversed course. She prevented him from consuming what she had prepared for him. She told him she was unwell. She disposed of what remained of the product. And then she went to confession. The sacrament of confession in the Catholic Church of 1650 was a private and privileged communication, protected by what the Church called the Sigillum Confessionis, the seal of confession, absolute in theory, binding the confessor to silence on pain of excommunication, regardless of what was told to him. A woman who had attempted murder and confessed it to her priest was, under this doctrine, protected. Her confessor could not report what she had said. He could not act on it in the secular sphere. He was required by the law of his church to receive the confession and impose the penance and keep silence. This is the part of the account that contains a gap, and the gap is significant. The priest reported it. The exact mechanism by which the confession passed from the confessional to the secular authorities is not documented in the sources available to us. What the record shows is that within some period of time following this unnamed woman's confession, an investigation began. Certain accounts suggest the priest consulted with a superior before acting. Others suggest that the priest reported directly on the grounds that an active, ongoing criminal conspiracy constituted an exception to the seal. The Roman Rota and church canon lawyers had debated for centuries whether the seal could be broken in cases of public necessity, and the debate had generally resolved against breaking, but generally is not universally. And a priest in 1650, facing a confession that implicated not one crime, but a network of unknown size, was navigating a situation for which the theological literature had not fully prepared him. What is recorded is that the seal broke, or was treated as broken, and the investigation began. The investigation moved quickly by the standards of 17th century Roman legal procedure. The papacy of Alexander VII, elected in 1655, and by 1659 fully occupied with consolidating his authority over the ecclesiastical and civil administration of Rome, had an institutional interest in treating the case with seriousness. 600 deaths attributed to a single woman selling poison through a cosmetics network was, if true, the most serious failure of public order Rome had experienced in living memory. The investigation, once it began, drew on the resources of the papal administration, the secular courts, and the network of informants that both maintained. Julia, for reasons the record does not fully explain, did not immediately flee. This is the decision that undid her, the choice to remain in Rome, to move her operation rather than abandon it, to take sanctuary in a church rather than leave the city entirely. Whether she believed the investigation would exhaust itself, whether she underestimated what the confession had revealed, whether she had simply been operating without serious interference for so long that the reality of imminent capture failed to land in the way it should have, this cannot now be determined. What the record shows is that she took refuge in a church, claiming the legal protection of ecclesiastical sanctuary, which was at that time still recognized in Roman law as a genuine impediment to secular arrest. The church sanctuary held for a period of weeks. The papal authorities, frustrated by the legal obstruction, eventually ordered Julia removed by force. Ecclesiastical sanctuary had been eroding as a practical protection throughout the 17th century. The Tridentine reforms and the gradual reassertion of secular criminal authority had both narrowed its scope, but its formal removal required papal authorization, and the authorization in this case was given directly by Alexander VII. The accounts described the scene briefly. Julia was taken from the church. The phrasing in one account is extracted, which is a careful word. She was brought to the Tor di Nona, the papal prison on the western bank of the Tiber, a building whose walls had processed the confessions of condemned persons for a century. The Tor di Nona was not a gentle institution. Interrogation in 17th century Roman judicial procedure included tortura, and the accounts confirm that Julia was subjected to it. The specific methods are not described in the sources available through non-specialist research, and this narrative will not speculate on them. What the record preserves is the outcome, a confession, a detailed confession, the names of clients, the names of distributors, the approximate number of deaths, the description of the product, the years of operation. Confessions extracted under torture are not reliable evidence in any modern legal sense. They produce what the tortured person believes the interrogators want to hear, shaped by pain into whatever form seems most likely to end the pain. Whether the details Julia provided were accurate in their particulars, whether the number 600 was her estimate or an interrogator's suggestion that she confirmed, whether the clients she named were truly clients or were named for other reasons, these questions cannot be settled. The confession exists. It is a document produced under extreme coercion. The trial records treat it as authoritative. Historians treat it with more care. What is not in serious dispute is the broad outline. The operation was real. The product was real. The deaths were real. The mechanics of distribution were real. The confession added detail to a framework of fact that had already been established by the investigation. She spoke in that prison somewhere in the autumn of 1659, in a room that smelled of stone and damp and the particular iron and tallow smell of a place where fire is kept burning not for warmth, but for other purposes. Whether she said what she believed, or what she calculated to be useful, or what she could no longer contain, this cannot be recovered. The confession was recorded. Her words were written down by a court notary in the Latin formulae of 17th century judicial procedure. Then they were used. The trial of Julia Tofana was not a lengthy affair. The judicial framework of Papal Rome in 1659 was not designed to produce the elaborate adversarial theater that later criminal law would generate. The expert witnesses, the competing testimonies, the prolonged examination of evidence. The case was considered proven. The confession had established the facts. The question was sentence. On July the 12th, 1659, Julia Tofana was executed. The method was hanging. Her daughter Girolama Spera was executed alongside her. Several associates were executed on the same day or shortly after. The accounts record the number of executions at between 5 and 7, depending on the source. The condemned were taken through the streets of Rome to the place of execution, in the manner customary for significant criminals, publicly, with the crowd assembled, the church present, the ritual of the thing performed according to its protocol. Julia was approximately 39 years old, by the most commonly cited reckoning. There is no speech attributed to her at the execution. This is unusual. The final speeches of condemned persons were often recorded, or at least paraphrased, in the chronicles and pamphlets that reported significant executions. The absence of a speech may reflect editorial choices in the sources, or it may reflect the actual record, that she said nothing, or nothing that anyone thought worth preserving. The pamphlets that circulated after the execution focused on the scale of the crime, the number of the dead, the ingenuity of the deception. They focused very little on the woman at the center of it. The women who had bought from her were not, in the main, prosecuted. Some were. The accounts mention a number of arrests and some executions among clients, but the investigation appears to have focused on the network itself, the production and distribution, rather than on pursuing every woman whose name appeared in Julia's confession. Whether this reflects a judgment that prosecuting 600 wives would have been administratively impossible, or a policy decision about the scale of scandal that could be managed, or simply the practical limits of 17th century investigative capacity, the record does not say. What it shows is that most of the women who purchased Aqua Tofana were never publicly identified. Their names, if they appeared in the confession, remained sealed in documents that have not all been published. Some of those documents may still exist in Italian archives. The unnamed woman who confessed to her priest, she disappears from the record entirely after the moment of her confession. What became of her husband, whether he lived or died, whether she herself was ever identified to the secular authorities, there is no document that settles these questions. She enters the record as the catalyst for Giulia's arrest and then is simply gone, swallowed back into the anonymity from which she briefly emerged. She was the turning point of the entire story, and she has no name and no ending. The recipe survived. This is not a claim that requires qualification. The documentary evidence is clear. Preparations identified as Aqua Tofana, or described in terms consistent with it, a clear arsenic solution used by women against husbands, sold through cosmetics networks, appear in court and church records from other Italian cities in the decades following Giulia's execution. They appear in Naples in the 1660s. They appear in accounts from Milan. They appear by name in discussions of poisoning published in France in the late 17th century. Whether these later preparations were made according to exactly Giulia's formula, or whether her name had become a shorthand attached to a category of product that predated her, the operational fact is the same. What she had demonstrated was reproducible. Someone learned the lesson. Multiple someones in multiple cities. The church and the civil authorities of Rome had executed Giulia Tofana and several of her associates. They had disrupted and probably destroyed the specific network she had built over 20 years in Rome and Naples. What they had not done, and could not do, was address the conditions that had generated the network's customers. The women who had purchased Aqua Tofana did not purchase it because Giulia Tofana existed. She existed because they purchased it. This distinction is not a defense of murder. 600 men are dead, if the figure is accurate. Whatever the circumstances of their marriages, they are dead, and their deaths were violent acts performed against their bodies without their knowledge. The record holds that. It does not excuse it. What the record also holds, spread across 2 decades of court petitions, dowry disputes, ecclesiastical records, and the silence of hundreds of women who found themselves with no recourse and eventually found a different one. What the record holds is a portrait of a system so efficient at containing women within harm that a poison network operating for 20 years could sustain a customer base estimated at 600 without running short of customers, without exhausting the supply of desperation, without any moment in which the demand for what Giulia was selling reduced to nothing because the problem it addressed had been solved. The problem was not solved. The network was destroyed. The problem continued. There is a question the record cannot answer, and it is the question that remains after everything else has been accounted for. It is not the question of the number, whether it was 600 or 400 or 800. The precise figure matters less than the fact that it was sustained, that it persisted, that 2 decades of operation did not exhaust the supply of women who needed what Giulia offered. It is not even the question of guilt. The legal categories are clear enough, however morally complicated the circumstances. The question is what the physicians were thinking, not maliciously. That is the point. Not corrupt, not complicit, not paid to look the other way. simply thinking what their training told them to think, recording what their frameworks prepared them to record, writing fever because the man had fever, writing flux because the man had flux, writing natural causes because the alternative, that this was not natural, that this had been done, was a hypothesis that nothing in their training had equipped them to form. They stood at hundreds of bedsides across the cities of Italy and wrote the wrong word, and then went home, and then stood at the next bedside. The apparatus of knowledge that was supposed to protect those men did not protect them. It documented their deaths in language that made them disappear. And the women who were not Julia's clients, the women who did not find the network, or could not afford it, or found it too late, or found a different endurance, they are not in this record at all. They are in the parish registers, the census rolls, the dowry contracts, the petitions that were denied. They are the background against which Julia's story is visible. They are more numerous. Giulia Tofana was executed in the summer of 1659, in Rome, in public, in front of a crowd. Her daughter died beside her. The product she had manufactured for nearly 30 years was confiscated and presumably destroyed. The vials, the labeled bottles, the cosmetic oil that was not cosmetic oil. But the formula had already left the room. It had left the room years before the arrest. And somewhere in the Naples of 1663, or the Milan of 1671, or the city we do not yet have a record for, somewhere, on a shelf in a room that smelled of rosewater and iron and the particular close warmth of a space too long inhabited, a small glass bottle sat among other small glass bottles. Clear contents, no smell, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it was, as anything else on the shelf. It had a label. The label said something innocent. The label told the truth about the container.